The first man never heard the shell arrive. In Normandy, in the summer of 1944, sound often followed destruction, not the other way around. One moment the Sherman moved forward through hedgerows, heavy with dust and leaves. The next, the interior was filled with pressure, heat, and a light so sudden it erased thought. A single hit, no warning, no time for theory. The shell struck the hull with practiced precision. German gunners had learned the angles. The Sherman's armor, adequate by design, thin by necessity, gave way in an instant. Inside the tank, the crew felt the impact not as noise, but as force. A violent compression of air that stole breath and balance at once. The vehicle shuddered, stopped, and became something else entirely. They had seconds, perhaps less. Ammunition racks lined the interior, stacked vertically along the walls. Designed for efficiency, not survival. When the penetrating round entered the fighting compartment, fragments sprayed outward like shrapnel from an explosion that had not yet happened. One fragment was enough. Propellant ignited. Then another. Then all of them. The crew called it cooking off. The phrase sounded harmless, almost domestic. In reality, it meant the tank was no longer a vehicle, but a furnace. Shells detonated in sequence, tearing through the turret from the inside. Flames filled the cramped space faster than men could move. Hatches jammed. Oxygen vanished. Steel glowed. What had been protection became a sealed container for fire. German soldiers watched these moments from cover and distance. They saw Shermans erupt after a single hit, black smoke rolling upward like a signal flare. Soon, they gave the tank a name, Ronson. Like the lighter, it ignited on the first strike. It was not mockery alone. It was observation. American crews learned the name differently. They learned it from burned wrecks lining the advance routes, from charred turrets thrown yards from their hulls, from the knowledge that survival often depended not on skill or courage, but on where a shell happened to land. They drove forward anyway. What none of them yet understood was that this weakness was already being studied, measured, and quietly addressed far from the hedgerows, where a small design change would soon decide who lived long enough to climb out. The truth did not emerge under fire. It existed long before Normandy, preserved in folders stamped confidential and read under fluorescent light. By the time Allied planners finalized the invasion, U.S. plans, intelligence already possessed detailed assessments of Germany's newest armored threat. Captured documents, battlefield reports from the Eastern Front, and technical analyses painted a consistent picture. The Sherman was not entering Europe blind. It was entering informed. The Panther was no rumor. Its specifications were known with uncomfortable precision. Sloped frontal armor approaching 80 millimeters rendered most American rounds ineffective beyond close range. Its high-velocity 75 millimeters gun could destroy a Sherman from distances where return fire was uncertain at best. In controlled tests and simulated engagements, the results repeated themselves without variation. German guns reached farther. They struck harder. They decided encounters before they began. American evaluators did not dispute the findings. Penetration charts showed Sherman shells flattening or deflecting against German frontal plates. After-action reports described engagements where crews maneuvered aggressively, fired accurately, and still failed to break through. Physics, not courage, dictated the outcome. In these assessments, the language remained professional, restrained, and unmistakably grim. Warnings followed. Analysts cautioned that frontal engagements would produce unsustainable losses, that numerical superiority could offset but not erase the disparity, that tank crews would bear the cost of a design philosophy rooted in mobility and mass production rather than survivability. These conclusions were circulated upward, softened by phrasing but not by meaning. Yet the problem was never that it was unknown. It was that acknowledging it fully would disrupt everything else. Factories were already producing Shermans by the thousands. Training manuals were written. Shipping schedules were fixed. A new tank or even a major redesign would slow the advance before it began. So the imbalance was reframed. Air support would compensate. Maneuver would substitute for armor. Numbers would overwhelm quality. The Sherman was declared adequate not because it was superior, but because it was available. And with that decision, a known weakness was accepted as doctrine, leaving those inside the tanks to discover, under fire, what had already been calculated in silence. This was the moment where the course hardened, where flexibility narrowed into commitment. Faced with the evidence, the U.S. Army did not deny the imbalance. It chose instead to manage it. The decision was not framed as sacrifice, but as necessity, an answer shaped by factories, shipping lanes, and calendars already in motion. American armored doctrine had been built on a different premise than Germany's. Tanks were not designed primarily to fight other tanks. That role belonged to tank destroyers, artillery, and aircraft. The Sherman's purpose was movement, supporting infantry, exploiting breakthroughs, advancing relentlessly. In that context, survivability meant something narrower: mechanical reliability, ease of repair, predictable performance under strain. Protection, by comparison, was negotiable. Thicker armor added weight, weight-reduced speed, speed-strained engines and transmissions. A tank that broke down before reaching the battlefield was useless, no matter how well armored it might be. In tests and trials, the Sherman excelled at what mattered most to planners. It ran, it turned, it crossed bridges, and it could be produced in enormous numbers without interruption. Redesigning the tank would threaten that balance. Even modest changes required retooling factories, retraining workers, revising supply chains already stretched across oceans. The war, it was argued, would not wait. Invasion schedules were fixed. Momentum was everything. Quantity, in this calculus, became a form of protection in itself. So the Sherman was locked in not because it was the best possible tank, but because it was the best possible compromise. Doctrine adjusted to accommodate its limits. Crews were taught to maneuver, to flank, to rely on coordination rather than confrontation. Air power would suppress enemy armor. Artillery would soften resistance. The Sherman would keep moving. What this meant in practice was rarely spoken aloud. Adaptation would be demanded at the sharpest edge of the war. Survival would depend on positioning, timing, and luck. Some crews would learn quickly. Others would not get the chance. The decision was finalized far from the sound of guns, but its consequences would unfold inside steel hulls, one engagement at a time, where adaptation was measured not in theory, but in seconds. And as the Shermans rolled forward, another question remained unanswered. How long could speed and numbers compensate for a vulnerability already written into the machine itself? The doctrine was simple, and it was unforgiving. American tank crews were taught not to fight German armor head-on. They were taught to think laterally, to maneuver, to survive through movement rather than mass. The Sherman was not meant to win by force. It was meant to win by position. Training emphasized flanking attacks. German tanks, instructors explained, were strongest at the front and weakest at the sides and rear. If a crew could close the distance, circle wide, and strike where armor thinned, the odds improved. Not dramatically, but enough. The battlefield became a problem of geometry rather than firepower. This required speed, coordination, and nerve. Crews were told to advance in groups, covering one another as they moved. One tank would draw fire while another shifted position. Infantry would protect the flanks. Artillery and aircraft would suppress the enemy. Victory would come not from a single machine, but from synchronization. The theory assumed time. It assumed visibility. It assumed terrain that allowed movement. Normandy offered none of these in abundance. Hedgerows narrowed fields of view to a few dozen meters. Roads funneled tanks into predictable paths. German gunners waited in concealment, engines silent, sights already aligned. In these conditions, maneuver was often a luxury. German tanks needed only one hit. Their guns could penetrate a Sherman from the front at range, and often did. American crews, by contrast, required multiple hits, precise placement, and favorable angles. Even when flanking succeeded, it demanded proximity, dangerously close distances where return fire was immediate and lethal. Doctrine filled the space where steel was thin. Crews adapted quickly because they had no choice. They learned to fire smoke rounds to obscure movement. They reversed out of danger rather than turning. They coordinated by hand signals and shouted commands. Survival became a skill honed under pressure, repeated engagement after engagement. Yet every tactical solution carried its own cost. Closing distance meant exposure. Flanking meant separation. Working in groups meant that when one tank was hit, others were often close enough to see it burn. Doctrine could improve odds, but it could not change the underlying equation. What had been decided in planning rooms now played out in real time, measured in wrecks and replacements. The Sherman advanced not because it dominated the battlefield, but because it could not stop. And as crews refined ways to outthink an enemy they could not outgun, A quieter realization began to take hold. Some problems could not be solved by tactics alone, but only by changing the machine itself. The first encounters erased theory in minutes. When American armored units met German tanks in strength, the battlefield delivered its verdict without hesitation. Sherman crews fired first, often accurately, watching their rounds strike enemy hulls and fail. Shells sparked, flattened, or slid away, leaving little more than scars on sloped steel. What should have been decisive hits became proof of futility. The response came immediately. German rounds traveled faster, farther, and with finality. When they struck, they did not glance or stall. They penetrated. A single hit tore through armor, ignited ammunition, and turned moving tanks into burning obstacles. The difference was unmistakable. One side absorbed fire. The other disintegrated under it. Inside American radios, discipline gave way to urgency. Calls overlapped. Coordinates blurred. Crews reported Panthers where none had been confirmed. Tigers where none were present. The distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that contact meant catastrophe. Orders came down quickly: advance, halt, flank, withdraw, sometimes all within the same minute. Some units froze, pinned by fire they could not answer. Others surged forward, closing distance in desperate attempts to reach vulnerable angles. Tanks bunched together on narrow roads, exactly where German gunners expected them. When the lead vehicle was hit, the columns stalled. When the second was hit, escape routes vanished. Burning wrecks blocked movement, trapping crews behind them in clouds of smoke and heat. Those who survived did so unevenly. Some escaped through hatches just before flames filled the turret. Others watched helplessly as neighboring tanks burned, knowing that seconds separated life from the same fate. The sight repeated itself across sectors: steel hulls glowing, ammunition detonating, silhouettes scrambling away from vehicles that moments earlier had felt solid and safe. Confidence collapsed quickly. Training had not prepared crews for the speed of the losses, or for the clarity of the imbalance. This was not attrition measured over weeks. It was shock delivered in minutes. Men who had crossed the channel believing in coordination and doctrine now understood how little those concepts mattered once the shooting began. By the end of those first battles, the Sherman was no longer an abstraction. It was a lived experience, one defined by limits, by fire, and by the knowledge that survival depended less on orders than on chance. And as word of these encounters spread through the armored divisions, a single question began to surface, quietly but insistently. How long could an army fight when its first lessons were written in burning steel? Anger did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, carried back from the front lines in after-action reports, stripped of emotion and written in careful language. Losses were acknowledged, but their causes were adjusted. Where crews described shells punching through armor, summaries spoke instead of unfavorable positioning. Where tanks burned after a single hit, the explanation became tactical error. Language mattered. Design failure disappeared from official correspondence. In its place came phrases like crew exposure and improper engagement range. Responsibility shifted quietly downward. The machine remained sound. The men, it was implied, had misused it. Tankers felt the shift immediately. Reports they had filed with blunt clarity returned, annotated, revised, or ignored. Requests for additional armor plating or revised ammunition stowage were denied as impractical or unnecessary. Heavier protection, they were told, would compromise mobility. Mobility, leadership insisted, was survival. Generals remained publicly confident. Briefings emphasized progress, territory gained, enemy losses inflicted. Statistics softened the picture. Replacement rates were cited as evidence of sustainability. The Sherman, leadership repeated, was performing within expectations. Losses, while regrettable, were acceptable. For the crews, the word landed hard. Acceptable to whom was never stated. Men rotated through replacement depots faster than lessons could be absorbed. Veterans warned new arrivals what the manuals did not. Keep moving. Never stop in the open. If hit, get out immediately. These instructions were passed quietly, not through doctrine, but through survival. Trust began to erode, not in command, perhaps, but in the assurances that had accompanied them into battle. Crews still followed orders. They still advanced, but belief that someone above them was listening, adapting, protecting, began to fade. The distance between planners and fighters widened with every engagement. Optimism remained intact at headquarters, where maps showed steady progress and arrows pointed east. At the front, optimism was replaced by calculation. Seconds to bail out, angles of fire, the weight of a hatch under stress. In this gap, morale did not collapse dramatically. It hardened. Crews learned not to expect solutions from above. They relied on one another, on improvisation, on experience bought at high cost. The Sherman became something they endured rather than trusted. And long before tanks were lost beyond recovery, something else failed quietly and completely: the belief that those inside them were considered expendable only on paper, not in practice. The contrast revealed itself without explanation. German tank crews did not rush. They did not improvise under pressure. They fought the way their machines allowed them to fight: methodically, from distance, and with confidence rooted in engineering rather than doctrine. Panthers and Tigers entered engagements already positioned for advantage. Their frontal armor faced forward, angled and thick enough to absorb punishment without consequence. American rounds struck and failed, announcing the Sherman's presence without threatening the vehicle itself. Each impact confirmed what German crews already understood. Time was on their side. German optics completed the equation. High-quality sights, carefully calibrated, allowed gunners to identify targets and range them with precision. First-shot kills were not acts of brilliance. They were the expected outcome of training paired with superior visibility. At ranges where Sherman crews struggled to spot muzzle flashes, German gunners were already correcting for wind and distance. This was not arrogance. It was discipline. German tank doctrine emphasized patience: wait, observe, fire once, move if necessary. The machine supported the method. Thick armor forgave hesitation. Powerful guns punished exposure. There was no requirement for clever maneuver. No need to close distance unnecessarily. Physics, not daring, decided the fight. In these engagements, simplicity prevailed. A Panther did not need to outthink a Sherman. It only needed to remain where it was strongest. Every design choice reinforced that reality. Armor protected the crew. Firepower ended the exchange quickly. Survivability was built into the steel itself, not deferred to tactics. American ingenuity met this reality unevenly. Crews adapted with smoke, movement, and coordination, but each adaptation added complexity under fire. German crews reduced complexity. They relied on mass, armor, and range. Where American doctrine demanded constant motion, German engineering rewarded stillness. The result was not universal dominance. German tanks were fewer, harder to maintain, and vulnerable in other ways. But in direct confrontation, the outcome followed predictable lines. When the terrain allowed distance, German tanks dictated the terms. When visibility favored patience, they struck first and decisively. There was no mystery to it. The machines performed exactly as intended. German engineers had built tanks to fight tanks. American engineers had built tanks to move wars forward. On open ground, those intentions collided. As reports accumulated, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Losses followed the same logic every time. Where German armor stood firm, Shermans burned. Where German guns spoke first, battles ended quickly. Yet even here, amid the clarity of steel and range, the story was not finished. Because while German engineering did what it was built to do, it also carried a weight cost, complexity, and rigidity that time and scale would soon test. And far from the battlefield, in factories measured not by precision but by output, another form of engineering was preparing to answer not with elegance but with inevitability. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement. It emerged quietly, carried by numbers that no longer aligned with expectations. Loss ratios compiled after successive engagements revealed a pattern too stark to ignore. Shermans were being destroyed faster than planners had projected, and faster than replacements could meaningfully compensate. Entire armored units disappeared in a matter of days. Not worn down, not gradually reduced, simply erased. Companies entered combat at full strength and exited with a handful of vehicles, sometimes none at all. The maps still showed progress, but the ledgers told a different story. Each advance was being paid for twice, once in steel, once in men. The replacement system strained under the pace. New crews arrived with training measured in weeks, not experience measured in survival. They inherited tanks modified by previous crews, learned habits passed down without documentation. and faced conditions no manual had prepared them for. Many did not last long enough to become veterans themselves. Those who did survive began to resist in subtle ways. Orders to advance across open ground were questioned, delayed, or reinterpreted. Veterans insisted on reconnaissance. They waited for artillery support. They refused frontal assaults framed as routine. These were not acts of insubordination, but of calculation. The cost of obedience had become too clear. Behind the lines, analysts revisited assumptions they had once considered settled. Charts were redrawn, projections adjusted. The disparity between expected and actual outcomes widened with each report. Something was no longer merely difficult or inconvenient. Something was fundamentally wrong. Denial did not collapse all at once. It cracked. Briefings grew shorter. Language became cautious. Optimism remained, but it was no longer confident. Speeches gave way to closed-door discussions, where the tone shifted from reassurance to reassessment. Questions once dismissed as impractical were raised again, this time without interruption. The Sherman itself became a subject not of defense, but of scrutiny, not as a symbol, but as a system. Its strengths were acknowledged. Its weaknesses were now undeniable. The arithmetic of war had forced the issue. Numbers, unlike doctrine, could not be flanked. This was not a moral awakening. It was a logistical one. The war could still be won, but not by ignoring the cost at which progress was being made. Attrition had limits. Morale had limits. Production, vast as it was, had limits when paired with human loss. In these quiet meetings, far from cameras and communiques, a realization settled in. The problem was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. And once measured honestly, it demanded response. The question was no longer whether change was needed, but whether it could arrive fast enough to matter. Humiliation rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, in revisions. In the months after Normandy, the tone inside Armored Command changed. The confidence that had once framed German tanks as over-engineered curiosities gave way to something more restrained. Lessons that had been dismissed now reappeared, stripped of attribution and urgency, but unmistakably present. Heavier guns were approved first, not as a reversal of doctrine, but as an adjustment. The 76mm gun, long delayed, repeatedly debated, was authorized for wider deployment. On paper, it offered modest improvement. In practice, it signaled something larger, the acknowledgement that the existing balance of firepower was no longer sufficient. Armor followed. Ammunition stowage was revised. Wet storage systems were introduced to reduce catastrophic fires. Incremental changes, each defensible on its own, together formed a quiet admission. Survivability mattered more than previously allowed. Protection was no longer negotiable. None of this was framed as imitation. Official language avoided comparison, but the influence was unmistakable. Sloped armor was studied more seriously. Engagement ranges were reconsidered. German emphasis on first-shot lethality was absorbed not through praise, but through necessity. What had once been mocked as excessive was now replicated selectively, carefully, and without ceremony. The Sherman evolved, but slowly. Production realities ensured that changes reached the front unevenly. Some units received improved models. Others continued fighting in earlier variants, unchanged except for the modifications crews had welded on themselves. The war did not pause to allow uniform improvement. Then came the purging. The M26 was not revolutionary in concept. It was simply appropriate. Thicker armor. A 90mm gun capable of engaging German tanks on more equal terms. A machine designed not just to move, but to fight. When Pershings appeared in Europe in early 1945, they were few in number and late in arrival, but their impact was immediate. Crews noticed the difference the moment they entered combat. Shots that once bounced now penetrated. Engagements that had required maneuver and luck could now be contested directly. The psychological shift was as important as the technical one. For the first time, American tankers felt their vehicle matched the threat ahead of them. And with that realization came an unavoidable question. Why now? The answer was not simple. Industrial momentum, strategic priorities, and doctrinal inertia all played their part. The Sherman had been built for a different phase of the war, and it had carried that burden longer than intended. By the time adaptation became unavoidable, the cost of delay had already been paid by those who fought in earlier months. The Pershing did not rewrite the war. Germany was already collapsing under pressure from every direction. But it rewrote something else, memory. It confirmed what crews had long suspected, that the problem had never been impossible to solve, only inconvenient. What arrived too late to save many lives nonetheless stood as proof. America could build tanks to fight tanks. It simply chose not to until the numbers, the losses, and the silence made choice impossible. And as the war moved toward its end, the Sherman story settled into a more complicated truth, not one of failure, but of delay and of lessons learned only after they had already been paid for in full. The contrast revealed itself without explanation. German tank crews did not rush. They did not improvise under pressure. They fought the way their machines allowed them to fight methodically, from distance, and with confidence rooted in engineering rather than doctrine. Panthers and Tigers entered engagements already positioned for advantage. Their frontal armor faced forward, angled and thick enough to absorb punishment without consequence. American rounds struck and failed, announcing the Sherman's presence without threatening the vehicle itself. Each impact confirmed what German crews already understood. Time was on their side. German optics completed the equation. High-quality sights, carefully calibrated, allowed gunners to identify targets and range them with precision. First-shot kills were not acts of brilliance. They were the expected outcome of training paired with superior visibility. At ranges where Sherman crews struggled to spot muzzle flashes, German gunners were already correcting for wind and distance. This was not arrogance. It was discipline. German tank doctrine emphasized patience. Wait, observe. Fire once, move if necessary. The machine supported the method. Thick armor forgave hesitation. Powerful guns punished exposure. There was no requirement for clever maneuver. No need to close distance unnecessarily. Physics, not daring, decided the fight. In these engagements, simplicity prevailed. A Panther did not need to outthink a Sherman. It only needed to remain where it was strongest. Every design choice reinforced that reality. Armor protected the crew. Firepower ended the exchange quickly. Survivability was built into the steel itself, not deferred to tactics. American ingenuity met this reality unevenly. Crews adapted with smoke, movement, and coordination, but each adaptation added complexity under fire. German crews reduced complexity. They relied on mass, armor, and range. Where American doctrine demanded constant motion, German engineering rewarded stillness. The result was not universal dominance. German tanks were fewer, harder to maintain, and vulnerable in other ways, but in direct confrontation, the outcome followed predictable lines. When the terrain allowed distance, German tanks dictated the terms. When visibility favored patience, they struck first and decisively. There was no mystery to it. The machines performed exactly as intended. German engineers had built tanks to fight tanks. American engineers had built tanks to move wars forward. On open ground, those intentions collided. As reports accumulated, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Losses followed the same logic every time. Where German armor stood firm, Shermans burned. Where German guns spoke first, battles ended quickly. Yet even here, amid the clarity of steel and range, the story was not finished, because while German engineering did what it was built to do, it also carried a weight cost, complexity, and rigidity that time and scale would soon test. And far from the battlefield, in factories measured not by precision but by output, another form of engineering was preparing to answer not with elegance, but with inevitability. The arrival of improved tanks did not feel like victory. It felt like relief measured, cautious, and overdue. When newer Shermans with revised ammunition storage and heavier guns reached the front, and when the first Pershings finally entered combat, crews sensed the difference immediately. Not in slogans or statistics, but in how the machine responded under fire. Survivability altered behavior. Tanks advanced with less hesitation. Crews held positions longer, trusting that a single hit would not automatically end everything. Engagements slowed, becoming deliberate rather than frantic. The constant calculation of escape routes gave way, briefly, to focus on the fight itself. Confidence returned, not bravado, but steadiness. Casualty rates reflected the change. Fires were less frequent. Penetrations did not always mean death. Crews survived hits that would have been fatal months earlier. The arithmetic of war shifted slightly, just enough to be noticed by those inside the steel. For the first time, The machine absorbed some of the burden it had long passed on to its crew. Yet this improvement carried a quiet weight. Normandy was already behind them. The Ardennes, fought in winter forests under desperate conditions, had already claimed its share. The hedgerows, the narrow roads, the early encounters where theory collapsed into flame, those chapters were closed. No amount of revised armor could reopen them. The men who benefited from the changes often knew this. Veterans recognized the timing with painful clarity. They fought better, lived longer, and wondered aloud why the difference had not come sooner. Newer crews inherited machines shaped by hard lessons, without always knowing how costly those lessons had been. Progress, when it arrived, saved lives, but only future ones. It did not reach backward. The tanks improved, but the past remained fixed, written in after-action reports and graves that no redesign could alter. The fix was real. Its limits were too. This did not diminish the achievement. Industrial systems adjusted. Doctrine evolved. Engineering caught up with reality. The American armored force that ended the war was not the one that had entered France. It was more cautious, more protected, and more honest about the nature of the fight. But history is not generous with timing. It rarely rewards adaptation when it is most needed. The war continued, yet its outcome was already clear. Germany was retreating on all fronts. Resources were exhausted. The decisive battles had been fought with earlier machines, under earlier assumptions. For those who survived long enough to feel the difference, the experience was bittersweet. They carried the knowledge that things could change, and that change, when delayed, carries its own cost. Confidence returned, but it was tempered by memory. As the front moved east and the fighting narrowed toward its end, the Sherman story became something more complex than success or failure. It became a lesson in momentum, in compromise, and in the price of learning under fire. The tanks improved, the war moved on, and progress, when it finally arrived, did so quietly too late to rewrite what had already been decided, but just in time to remind everyone why it mattered. The consequences were never summarized in a single figure. They appeared instead as accumulations after action tallies, replacement rosters, casualty lists that grew longer as the war moved forward. Thousands of American tankers were killed in Europe. Many of them died inside Shermans that burned exactly as crews had feared they would. Not every loss was preventable. War does not allow that illusion. But many deaths followed a pattern that had been identified early, discussed quietly, and accepted reluctantly. Ammunition ignited, armor failed. Crews were trapped with seconds to escape. These were not rare anomalies. They were repeatable outcomes of known design compromises. After the war, official histories told a different story. They emphasized victory correctly. They highlighted production triumphs, logistical brilliance, and the sheer scale of American industry. The Sherman appeared as a symbol of reliability and momentum, a machine that carried Allied forces from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. It was not portrayed as controversial. It was portrayed as necessary. The debates that had shaped it remained largely absent. The memo's warning of imbalance, the test results showing penetration failures, the internal disagreements over armor versus speed. These details faded into archives, known to specialists but rarely discussed in public memory. The narrative preferred clarity over complication. Families were never briefed on those debates. Letters spoke of bravery, of duty fulfilled, of sacrifice in the service of a just cause. They did not mention that alternative designs had been considered and delayed. They did not explain why a son or husband might have survived in a different machine. Grief was given meaning, but not context. Statistics replaced faces. Losses were measured per division, per month, per campaign. They appeared as percentages and charts, abstracted from the interiors of burning tanks, where decisions made far away became final. Numbers allowed distance. Distance allowed closure. Silence followed naturally. Accountability is difficult in victory. When wars are won, questions feel disruptive. Success settles arguments without resolving them. The Sherman had carried the war forward, and that fact alone seemed to justify every compromise made along the way. Yet, among veterans, memory remained more precise. They remembered which hits could be shrugged off and which could not. They remembered the smell of burning insulation, the weight of hatches that sometimes opened and sometimes did not. They remembered improvisations that worked and official assurances that did not. This was not bitterness. It was clarity. The understanding that outcomes are shaped not only by enemies, but by choices. that industrial momentum can save nations while costing individuals. That design is never neutral when lives depend on it. History would remember the Sherman as a success, and in many ways it was. But beneath that verdict lay another record, one written in crews lost before fixes arrived, in lessons learned too late for those who taught them. Their story was never one of failure. It was one of consequence. And in the quiet space between victory and remembrance, a final truth remained. Wars are not only won by what is built, but by when and at whose expense. For generations, American war stories had followed a familiar arc. Ingenuity overcame adversity. Improvisation solved what planning could not. When material fell short, intelligence filled the gap. It was a powerful belief, reinforced by victories won through speed, scale, and adaptation. In Europe, that belief met its limit. Clever doctrine had carried the Sherman as far as it could. Maneuver replaced armor. Coordination substituted for protection. Training compensated for vulnerability. For a time, these solutions worked well enough to sustain momentum. But war does not reward effort equally. It rewards outcomes. And outcomes, eventually, are governed by physics. Armor cannot be reasoned with. Penetration tables do not respond to optimism. A shell either defeats steel or it does not. No amount of coordination can change that fact in the instant it matters most. American planners had trusted that excellence, well-trained crews, flexible tactics, superior logistics would offset material disadvantages. They assumed men would rise to meet the machine's limits. German engineers made a different assumption. They designed tanks on the expectation that soldiers would fail, that crews would be surprised, fatigued, disoriented, that mistakes were inevitable. Armor existed not as a luxury, but as forgiveness. Steel absorbed what human judgment could not always avoid. This philosophical difference mattered. American design placed responsibility on the crew. German design placed responsibility on the machine. In controlled environments, excellence could narrow that gap. In sustained combat, it widened it. War punished the assumption that human performance would remain flawless under fire. The result was a moral reversal few anticipated. Ingenuity, once celebrated as the decisive advantage, became a coping mechanism rather than a solution. Adaptation kept men alive longer, but it did not correct the imbalance. Improvised armor, tactical creativity, and coordination reduced losses, but they did not eliminate the conditions that caused them. Optimism had shaped planning. Pessimism had shaped engineering. On the battlefield, pessimism proved more durable. Overbuilding was not wasteful when survival depended on margins. Redundancy was not inefficiency when the first plan failed. German tanks embodied this logic, even as their complexity carried other strategic costs. This was not an argument for German superiority. Their approach had limits of its own: maintenance burdens, production constraints, inflexibility. But in the narrow space where tanks met tanks, their assumptions aligned more closely with reality. They built for the worst day, not the best crew. American planners learned this slowly. The realization did not arrive as condemnation, but as recalibration. Doctrine shifted. Design priorities changed. Protection gained status alongside mobility. The myth did not collapse dramatically. It cracked. Hairline fractures spreading through assumptions long held as self-evident. The war moved on, and the United States adapted, as it always had. But the lesson lingered uncomfortably. Intelligence and courage could not always substitute for material truth. Innovation mattered, but timing mattered more. Ingenuity, when asked to compensate for known weaknesses, carried a hidden cost. That cost was paid by those who faced consequences first, not by those who framed the assumptions. It was paid in burning compartments and narrow escapes, in lessons learned by survivors and taught too late to others. In the end, the Sherman did not fail because Americans lacked ingenuity. It strained because ingenuity was asked to shoulder a burden it was never meant to carry alone. And as the war closed, one final understanding emerged: victory does not absolve assumptions. It only delays the moment when their price becomes clear. The lesson did not announce itself as philosophy. It emerged through repetition, through the same outcomes playing out under different skies, against different opponents, with the same unforgiving logic. Steel behaved as steel always does. Fire followed penetration, and men paid the difference between assumption and reality. Survivability was never cowardice. It was foresight. The belief that protecting crews diminished aggressiveness had been proven hollow by experience. Crews who trusted their machines fought longer, held positions more deliberately, and made clearer decisions under pressure. Fear did not disappear, but it no longer dictated every second. Protection did not weaken resolve, it steadied it. Over-engineering, long criticized as inefficiency, revealed its value in the narrow margins that separated life from death. Redundant systems, thicker armor, heavier components, these were not luxuries when the battlefield allowed no forgiveness. They absorbed mistakes, misjudgments, and moments of bad luck that no amount of training could eliminate. War, conducted by humans, always contains error. Machines must account for that. Simplicity, too, demanded reconsideration. It had been praised as elegance, as reliability, as speed. But simplicity without margin became fragility. A design optimized only for ideal conditions faltered when reality intervened. True strength lay not in minimalism, but in resilience, the ability to function imperfectly and still protect those inside. Doctrine, for all its structure and language, proved secondary to physics. Armor thickness could not be negotiated. Gun velocity could not be reframed. Engagement ranges could not be willed shorter. When doctrine aligned with physical reality, it amplified effectiveness. When it contradicted it, doctrine became instruction in how to lose more slowly. Production schedules had shaped decisions more than admitted. Factories demanded consistency. Logistics demanded predictability. Momentum demanded continuity. These pressures were real, and they mattered. But they did not change what happened when a shell met steel. The battlefield enforced its own timetable, indifferent to planning charts and quarterly outputs. Pride, too, played its role. Confidence in national systems, in industrial genius, in the belief that adaptability could overcome any initial disadvantage, these convictions were not baseless. They had succeeded before. But confidence hardened into assumption, and assumption delayed correction. The cost of that delay was not theoretical. It was measured in crews who fought inside machines already known to be inadequate for the task demanded of them. Theory followed its own logic, elegant and internally consistent. Tanks were assigned roles. Other assets would compensate. Combined arms would solve disparities. These ideas were not wrong in isolation. But war does not occur in isolation. It compresses variables, removes options, and exposes weak links. When theory encountered terrain, weather, visibility, and enemy intent, its margins vanished. The Sherman story forced a reckoning not with failure, but with compromise. The tank was not useless. It was not incompetent. It was effective within limits that were exceeded too often, for too long, without adjustment. The lesson was not that America should have built German tanks. It was that design must begin with the assumption of worst conditions, not best intentions. This understanding reshaped armored warfare in the years that followed. Post-war designs emphasized crew protection as a primary requirement, not a secondary benefit. Survivability became a metric of effectiveness, not an obstacle to it. The steel grew thicker, the systems more redundant. The lessons were absorbed because they had been paid for. But absorption came after the fact. It always does. Progress rarely arrives in time to save those who reveal its necessity. The war ended, doctrines evolved, and new machines replaced old ones. The burned-out hulls remained where they had fallen, silent reminders of decisions made far from their final resting places. The lesson written in steel and fire was not gentle, and it was not abstract. It stated plainly that war does not reward optimism. It rewards preparation for failure. That survivability is not hesitation. It is respect for physics, for human limits, and for the lives placed inside machines asked to do impossible things. And when doctrine follows physics, rather than production schedules, pride, or theory, the cost of learning is lower. History offered that lesson without apology. Whether it is remembered before it must be relearned remains the unanswered question. America won the war. That fact is not in question. The flags were raised, the armies advanced. The machinery of victory moved steadily east until resistance collapsed beneath its weight. History records the outcome clearly, and rightly so. But not every argument inside that war was settled by victory. The Sherman rolled forward because it had to. It moved because momentum demanded movement, because stopping would have meant something worse than loss. It would have meant doubt. Production lines were running. Invasion schedules were fixed. An army in motion cannot pause easily to reconsider the machine carrying it. The tank advanced not because it was right, but because it was ready. Inside it were men who understood this distinction instinctively. They did not debate doctrine while shells fell. They did not weigh industrial philosophy while hatches glowed red with heat. They fought with what they were given, adapting, enduring, and trusting that survival would come from judgment measured in seconds. For many, it did not. They paid for that choice, not in abstraction, but in fire. Steel failed where it was known to fail. Ammunition ignited where it had been warned it might. Crews died where planners had hoped tactics would suffice. None of this was hidden from those who experienced it. It was only distant from those who decided it. History often treats machines as symbols. The Sherman became one of American industry, of reliability, of mass and movement. In that role, it succeeded. It carried an army across a continent. It overwhelmed an enemy already stretched thin. It helped end a war that needed ending. But symbols simplify what reality complicates. The Sherman was also a compromise, extended beyond the moment when compromise was safe. It was a design